We're hearing about massive missile and drone attacks from Russia today. What is the latest on the ground there in Kyiv and in other Ukrainian cities?
Well, that's true. I'm as a person who constantly work in the east and the south of Ukraine, so basically, it's already quite basically repetition. Interesting. Every time when I come back to Kiev, I always hear the missiles or interception of the missiles. So basically, I'm just want to describe that the presence of the voice constantly with people here. Indeed, according to the Ukrainian officials, 61 missiles were intercepted out of 71. In the eastern part of the country, there was a damage of the infrastructure, energy infrastructure. In Kharkiv, 8 people were injured as a result of such attacks. And I heard today around 10 o'clock some sound of the some sound of the explosions. It could be the interception of the missiles,
Mm.
but
And, we've been talking for a long time now about, an anticipated spring offensive from the Russians. I was speaking to a general yesterday who said that offensive has now begun. It must feel very much that way on the ground to you, does it?
I don't know. It's the we also anticipated the possible and potential escalation and another offensive of the Russians. I can say only from my experience. I've been visiting the northern border of Ukraine, and I've noticed. And sorry, the intel tells that Russians are occasionally conduct subversive operations. They use drones over there, so they just and occasionally they shell as well the Ukrainian positions. I've heard also the sound. I was yesterday in Sumy region and I heard the sound of shelling. So what I can say is that Russia is probably trying to disperse the common efforts of the Ukrainian military in the areas such as Bakhmut and Ugledar in Donetsk and Lugansk regions. So in order to prevent the relocation of the troops in Donbass region.
Mm.
So we do anticipate the attacks, but it can happen next week. And as Russia actually likes different symbolism, so it can happen only even on the 24th of February as well.
Right. So this is very much a prelude to what's to come, you fear. I just very briefly, the impact on Ukraine of these missile strikes. I know, the Ukrainians have said that a lot of the missiles have been shot down, but what has been the impact in terms of particularly of the infrastructure and the energy facilities?
Well, in the past couple of weeks, actually, the situation with energy became better because half of January was relatively warm. But it's a big problem for the power stations when the temperature drops down. Like now, in some parts of Ukraine, it is minus 15, like in the north. So the missiles that hit today, the energy infrastructure, of course, caused the big deficit in several regions of Ukraine. I don't feel it here in Kiev, but in Kharkiv region and Dnipropetrovsk region, there are power cuts. So for several days, it might need to be stabilized, and people will, of course, it will affect life of population here.
If it's starting, it's getting off to a rolling start. I know you spoke to Richard Barons, didn't you, last night?
Yeah, that's right.
And
Yeah.
he said, yeah, it started, and I think he knows more about it than I do. But I think these are more likely to be shaping operations, trying to build up some pressure. I mean, at the moment, the Russians are pushing on the areas where they'd lost ground. So Kreminsk to Svatove along the P66, they're pushing quite hard there, and a bit further south at Vuhledar, where they'd lost ground before. And I suspect that this is to, as it were, fix Ukrainian forces in place, make it impossible for Ukrainian forces to disperse and leave the area. So
Right.
it looks as if there may be a sort of shaping operation going on. And we do know that the Russians have been using elements of 3 quite big divisions, or quite important divisions for these operations. So these are not Wagner mercenaries. These are not just new recruits. These are fairly hardened divisions that they're
Mm.
applying. So something is starting, but I think we'll see a lot more than this. As and when this offensive starts, I think it'll be very multi-pronged. They'll try and stretch the Ukrainians in several directions at once, and then we'll see where they really intend to go, which I suspect will be into the Donbass and across the land bridge again to solidify the links into Crimea.
Well, that's fascinating insight, and obviously it's so hard to predict what happens next, what's really going on inside Putin's head, and his generals and so on. But how, in terms of what might happen next, you touched on it there. How well equipped do you think Russia is now against Ukraine for this next phase of the war?
Well, they've certainly got some more equipment coming. I mean, the Ukrainians are making a big, the Ukrainians are giving out the numbers, and they were saying, I think last night, that the Russians have got another 1,800 tanks arriving in the theatre. Well, that's true, or seems to be true, but they've lost over 1,700 tanks, probably more than that. So they're replacing the equipment that they've lost. I don't think there's going to be a huge surge in equipment. And the troops that they're going to bring forward, probably another 200,000, not really 300,000, but say up to 200,000 that they bring forward will not have been terribly well trained. But they will be reorganized, and commanders, if not the troops won't be much different, because that takes a long time to fix. But the commanders won't be as clueless as they seemed to be a year ago, and I think they won't make the same sort of mistakes that they made then. And we can expect the Russians to operate in a more coordinated way than they did in February, March, and April. So, like all military professionals, they'll learn from their mistakes. But they can't put right the structural problems they've got of corruption and bad training and poor equipment and logistics. That takes years to put right.
Well, taking those two considerations into account then, and, mistakes were made, serious mistakes by Russia in the first phase of the war, the first year of the war. Do you think this next phase, however long that might be, and we'll come to that in a moment, do you think it will see Russia getting back the upper hand that it hasn't felt as if it's had for the first year?
No, that's the $64,000 question. Will they actually, by sheer weight of numbers and some better tactics, will they be able to push the Ukrainians back? It's all a matter of time now, which is why I think the Russians may be starting this offensive early. And they're not really well equipped to go early, but they seem to be going early because they're worried about the amount of Western equipment the Ukrainians are now getting and what they might do with it. I think the Ukrainians have got a good chance of holding the Russian attack, but whether the Ukrainians can really make a big impression on it then will depend on lots of other factors. I mean, most of us in the West would like to see the Ukrainians hold the attack and then break it up into 3 or 4 different pieces. That would be very good to watch. But holding the attack is one thing, and I think the Ukrainians can do that probably. But actually being decisive themselves, scoring a sort of decisive victory on the battlefield, so it changes the nature of the game on the battlefield, that will be much harder to do. And if they do it, it won't be until the summer or the autumn, probably.